I was sitting on the edge of my own couch at 1 in the morning, hands clasped together, staring at a woman I did not know. She was curled up under a blanket I'd thrown over her, dark hair fanned across the pillow, breathing slow, even. My apartment smelled like the wine she'd had at the bar, and underneath that, faintly, like rain, because it had started drizzling on the drive home. Her phone lit up once on my coffee table, screen glowing in the dark room. I wasn't trying to look. I want to be clear about that. But the lock screen was too bright to miss. A photo of her laughing, arm looped through a man's arm. A man I recognized instantly, because I'd seen that same face on a wall of framed photos every single morning for 4 months, right outside the executive elevator. Richard Ashford, my CEO. My boss's wife was asleep on my couch, and I had no idea yet, none, how much that one fact was about to cost me, or what it was going to give me back. Let me back up. My name's Nathan Cole, 33, financial analyst at Ashford Whitmore Capital, a mid-sized investment firm downtown that had, not that long before this, hired me after a recruiting process aggressive enough that I still didn't fully believe I'd earned the seat. I grew up outside a small town in Ohio. My dad ran a hardware store. My mom kept the books for half the businesses on Main Street. They raised me on a philosophy so simple it barely sounds like one. Show up, do the work, don't make a scene. I carried that into everything, including a marriage that had quietly ended about 2 years before this story actually starts. Her name was Kayla. 7 years together, 4 married, no kids, no big blow-up. Just 2 people who sat across from each other one evening and realized, without much anger left between them, that they wanted different lives. She moved back near her family. I stayed in the city, alone, in a 2-bedroom apartment that suddenly felt about 1 bedroom too big. After the divorce, my routine got small. Work, home, dinner for one, a book before bed. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't really living either. I was existing inside a life that fit the way clothes fit after you lose weight you didn't mean to lose. Still wearable, just hanging wrong in all the places that used to fit. Richard Ashford ran that firm like a surgeon runs an OR. Precise. Exacting. Zero patience for anyone who couldn't keep pace. Industry famous for being brilliant, and just as famous for being difficult. A man whose name alone could end a meeting early, if he'd already decided it wasn't worth his time. I was 4 months in, still technically inside my probation window, still proving every single morning that I deserved the desk they'd given me. The one person I was actually close to there was Priya, 3 years at the firm, and she'd made it something of a personal mission to drag me out of my apartment at least once a month, before you fully turn into furniture. Her words. That Friday, Priya wanted to hit a rooftop bar downtown for a coworker's birthday. I told her I was tired. She told me I was always tired, and that was exactly the problem. So I went. String lights swaying in the breeze. Crowd thick enough that I found a quiet corner by the railing, nursing a drink, already half planning my exit strategy. That's when I noticed her, alone at the far end of the bar, dark hair loose, wearing a dress that felt slightly too elegant for the room, working on what looked like her 4th or 5th drink, eyes red, unfocused. The bartender caught my eye and nodded toward her. The universal, "Is she with you?" "Look," I shook my head, then walked over anyway. I still don't have a clean answer for why. She looked up at me, glassy-eyed. "I didn't ask for a babysitter." "I'm not applying for the position," I said. She almost laughed at that. Almost. Then she tried to stand, caught her heel on the bar stool, and nearly went down before I got a hand on her elbow. I asked where she lived. She shook her head. Something about a high floor, a doorman, but no street name. Nothing I could actually type into a map. I stood in that parking lot afterward with a drunk stranger who couldn't remember her own address, weighing exactly 2 options. Put her in a rideshare to nowhere in particular, or bring her somewhere I was safe, my place, 10 minutes away. I chose the second option, and I regretted it almost instantly. Not because it felt wrong, because I understood exactly how it would look to anyone who happened to be watching. I just didn't know yet that someone... I drove home in silence, her head resting against the window, breath fogging the glass. Helped her up the stairs, got her onto the couch, pillow under her head, blanket over her shoulders, water and 2 aspirin on the coffee table next to her purse. That's when her phone lit up. Richard Ashford. My stomach dropped clean through the floor. I stood in my own living room staring at that screen, and every rational instinct I had was screaming that this was the start of something bad. I went into my bedroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute before I tore a page out of a notebook and wrote 5 lines. "You're safe. This is my apartment. I'm in the other room. Nothing happened. Nathan." I left it on the coffee table, next to the water and the aspirin. Then I lay down on the hardwood floor of my own bedroom with a spare blanket, staring at the ceiling until I finally went under, sometime past 3. I woke before she did, back aching from the floor. Offering her my actual bed had felt too intimate for a stranger. Taking the couch back had felt cruel. The floor was the only option that felt like it wouldn't make anything worse. I made coffee. A few minutes later, I heard the couch creak, slow footsteps, then a long silence, which meant she'd found the note. She appeared in the kitchen doorway holding it, hair tangled, mascara smudged, looking like someone trying to piece together the last 12 hours out of scattered fragments. "Nathan," she said, reading it again like it might change. "You couldn't remember your address," I said. "This was the only place I knew was safe. I slept on the floor. Nothing happened." She was quiet for almost a full minute. Then, "Most guys would have just left me at the bar." "Most guys aren't me," I said. Wasn't a boast. Just the plain, undecorated way my father taught me to talk. She called a rideshare, gathered her things, left without giving me her name or any way to reach her. I stood at the window and watched the car pull away, genuinely believing that was the whole story. A strange night I'd maybe tell someone at a bar in 5 years, and nothing more. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that week. Monday, Priya elbowed me in the hallway outside the trading floor. "Boss's wife's in the building today," she said, nodding toward the glass-walled executive corridor. I looked through the partition. There she was, Claire Ashford, blazer buttoned to the collar, hair pulled into something controlled and clean. A completely different woman than the one who'd been on my couch 2 nights before. Her eyes swept the floor, passed over the analysts' desks, and stopped on me for exactly 1 beat before she kept walking like nothing had happened. She'd recognized me. I recognized, just as clearly, the exact moment she chose not to show it. Over the following weeks, Claire started showing up more, officially managing a rebrand initiative that gave her a legitimate reason to be on site several days a week. But I started noticing things that didn't quite fit that explanation. She found reasons to walk the analyst floor. She asked me detailed questions about market modeling, detailed enough that she had to sit at my desk while I explained them. She brought coffee for the team one morning and somehow already knew I took mine black, no sugar. We'd never talked about that. One afternoon, I found her portfolio folder left behind in an empty conference room. I walked it down to her office. She took it with a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I keep leaving things around you," she said. I didn't have anywhere to put that sentence. I thought about it for the rest of the day, and the day after that. One evening, we were the last 2 people in the office, building quiet except for the ventilation hum and the city glowing faint through the windows. Claire sat on the edge of a desk in an empty conference room, shoes off, cradling a cold cup of coffee, and told me about Preston Vance. Preston was a senior partner, close to Richard for over a decade, and had spent years quietly positioning himself as heir apparent to the whole company. That position had gotten shakier the last 2 years, not because Richard had lost faith in his work, but because Richard had started keeping something back from him, a distance Preston noticed and hated. He'd built his entire career on being the man Richard trusted completely. Losing even a piece of that trust wasn't a professional setback to him. It was personal. Claire didn't know all of that yet, not that night. What she told me was smaller and heavier, that her marriage had been quietly strained for a long time. Not betrayal, just 2 people who'd stopped actually talking, both swallowed by the company, too tired at the end of each day to notice how far apart they'd drifted. "I wasn't just drunk that night," she said, staring at the floor. "I'd told Richard that same afternoon that I thought we needed to separate. He didn't take it well. I didn't know where else to go. So I went to a bar alone, and the first person who was actually kind to me in months was a stranger who didn't even know my name." I didn't have anything to say to that either. It just sat in my chest and stayed there. A few days later, Richard called me into his office, officially about a client portfolio. Before I made it through the door, he stopped me. "I keep my work and my family separate, Cole," he said, watching me over his glasses. "I expect everyone else to do the same." Wasn't quite a threat. Landed like one anyway. Preston Vance had been watching all of this a lot more closely than anyone realized, and in the tension quietly building between Richard's marriage and my presence at the firm, he finally saw the leverage he'd been circling for years. It started in Richard's office, loud enough to carry to my desk through the open door. "Did you know, Preston said, pitched just enough to be heard. That one of your junior analysts drove your wife home in the middle of the night? He let that hang there. No context. No explanation. Just the bare, damning shape of it, arranged in exactly the order that did the most damage. Later that day, he cornered me near the break room. He'd gotten hold of a few seconds of grainy security footage from my building's entrance, me guiding an unsteady Claire through the door at nearly midnight. No audio, no note, no water, no aspirin. Just a man and a visibly intoxicated woman disappearing inside. You know exactly how that looks, Cole, he said. Calm, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. And so will everyone else. Here's the part I didn't find out until much later. The part that changes how you should be hearing this whole section. Preston didn't just find that footage. He'd had a private security contact monitoring the building for weeks already, because he suspected, correctly, that Richard's trust in him was slipping, and he wanted something, anything, he could use if that slippage ever turned into a real threat to his position. What he found instead was better than anything he'd been looking for, and he didn't hesitate. He trimmed 6 seconds of context off both ends of that clip, the part where Claire nearly fell reaching for the door handle herself, and the part, the next morning, where I left my own bedroom alone. He sent the edited version to Richard within the hour. I was sitting across from the CEO before I'd even finished my coffee, the clip frozen on his laptop at the exact frame where my hand steadied Claire's waist through the doorway. Explain, Richard said. One word. I told him everything. The bar, the missing address, the note, the floor, the empty rideshare the next morning. Nothing had happened. Nothing would have. I hadn't even known who she was until her phone lit up after she was already asleep. Richard sat with that for a long time. Long enough that I genuinely couldn't read which way it was going to break. Then he said, I'll ask Claire. I told him he should. But I understood, watching his face, that believing me and acting like he believed me were two very different things for a man like Richard, and for now, he wasn't ready to do the second one. Next morning I was reassigned, moved to a satellite office handling a mid-tier client portfolio, 40 minutes across town. Nothing to do with the rebrand. Nothing to do with Claire. On paper, anyway. Claire found out that afternoon and didn't take it quietly. She walked into Richard's office and shut the door behind her. I couldn't make out words through the wall, but I could hear the tone. Not pleading. Controlled. Precise anger. The voice of someone who'd spent years being managed around and had finally decided to speak entirely for herself. Preston found me in the parking garage that evening, leaning on his car with the easy confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. She'll get bored eventually, he said, checking his watch like I was a minor inconvenience between meetings. She always does with things that don't matter. I didn't say anything. Got in my car. Drove home, with my hands shaking on the wheel. Not from fear, from the effort of holding back everything I actually wanted to say to him. 2 days after that, an interoffice envelope showed up at my new desk. Inside, a folded note in Claire's handwriting. I'm not letting this one go. I understood immediately she wasn't talking about the reassignment. Weeks went by, no calls, no texts. I buried myself in the new portfolio, trying not to think about her, which of course meant thinking about her constantly, and underneath that, a colder thought I couldn't quite shake. Even if Preston's footage got exposed as edited, even if I was cleared completely, I'd still be the guy who almost lost his job over the CEO's wife. That reputation doesn't fully wash off. Not in a firm like that one. I didn't know yet that Preston's ambition was about to outrun his caution, and that the same instinct that made him send that footage in the first place was going to be the thing that finally exposed him. Then, one Thursday evening, my doorbell rang. Claire was standing there, no makeup, hair loose, holding takeout from a place 3 blocks down. I figured you eat alone most nights, she said. I do too. We sat on my living room floor, the same hardwood I'd slept on the night I first brought her home. She noticed. Is this where you slept? I nodded. She went quiet a long time after that. She told me she'd finally laid out everything for Richard. Preston's manipulation, the years of quiet distance in the marriage, what she'd actually been running from that night at the bar. Richard had listened, fully, for maybe the first time in longer than she could remember. But she also told me something I hadn't expected, that listening hadn't come easy, or fast. Richard had spent almost a full week barely speaking to her at all, not out of cruelty, she said, but because a man who ran his entire life on precision and control had just been handed proof that he'd trusted the wrong person for over a decade. and he needed that week just to sit with what that actually meant about his own judgment. Then she set her chopsticks down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. "I need to tell you something. I didn't end up at that bar randomly. I'd seen you before, at a firm event, months earlier. I asked someone your name. I don't know exactly what I was hoping would happen that night, but it wasn't an accident that I was there. If we do this," I said slowly, "your husband could end my career. You understand that?" She looked at me without blinking. "If he fires someone for being decent to me, that says more about him than it does about you. He already knows that, actually. That's part of why this took him a week and not 5 minutes." I didn't kiss her that night. We washed the takeout containers side by side in my narrow kitchen sink, not saying much, and she left a little after 11, leaving her portfolio folder on my counter. "On purpose," she told me at the door. Small, deliberate smile. Here's the part most versions of this story skip past too fast. Preston didn't get caught because Richard suddenly had a change of heart. He got caught because he made one more move he didn't need to make. About a week after Claire's conversation with Richard, Preston went looking for the original, unedited security footage, the full file, still sitting on a server he technically wasn't supposed to have access to anymore, now that Richard's trust in him had visibly cracked. He wanted to delete it. Make sure no one could ever compare his 6-second edit to the real thing. He didn't know Richard had already quietly pulled a copy 3 days earlier, the moment he'd started doubting the version Preston gave him, a habit Richard had built over 20 years of never fully trusting a single source on anything that mattered. When IT flagged an after-hours access attempt on a restricted file by someone with no current business reason to be touching it, that flag landed straight on Richard's desk. Richard didn't say a word to Preston. He just sat both files side by side, the real one and the edited one, and watched the 6 seconds Preston had cut. Claire reaching for the door handle herself, unsteady but capable, no assistance needed. Me, the next morning, walking out of my own bedroom alone while Claire was still asleep on the couch. That was the moment it stopped being about me and Claire, and became about what kind of man Richard had been building his company next to for 10 years. Claire and Richard separated formally about 3 months later. That decision genuinely didn't have much to do with me. The marriage had been ending long before that night at the bar, and both of them, in their own ways, seemed almost relieved once it was finally said out loud instead of quietly endured underneath work schedules and closed doors. Richard called me into his office once more, near the end of that process. I fully expected termination. Instead, in his usual clipped way, he told me he'd reviewed the complete, unedited footage timeline, including the 6 seconds Preston had cut from both ends. "I don't like any of this," he said, "but I asked you a direct question once, and you told me the truth before you had any reason to think I'd believe you. Preston had the real footage the whole time and chose to hand me a version built to make you look guilty. That tells me plenty about who actually deserved my trust going forward. And it wasn't him." Preston was let go within the month, not just for the edited footage, but for the after-hours access attempt that exposed it, and for a handful of other things about his conduct that had apparently been quietly building for years, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see the pattern. It's been a little over a year since that night at the rooftop bar. Claire and I are together now, genuinely. No secrecy, no boardroom hanging over either of our heads. I still have the same secondhand couch. She still reminds me, half joking, that it was the least glamorous place she's ever fallen asleep, and also the first place in years she actually felt safe. I think about that night a lot, how close I came to just calling a rideshare and walking away before any of this ever had the chance to become something. How easily Preston's version of events could have worked exactly the way he planned it, if Richard hadn't eventually chosen to stop trusting the easy story and go looking for the real one. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that doing the right thing rarely looks heroic while you're doing it. Most of the time it just looks like staying one more hour, writing a note, sleeping on your own floor so a stranger can rest without being afraid. I didn't know, that night, who she was, or what it was going to cost me to find out. I only knew she needed somewhere safe. Everything else that mattered came after. If this one got you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.